Hello, my little mathematicians. Today we're going to practice the second half of our percent study guide, and we're focusing on how to convert back and forth between percents, decimals, and fractions. No matter how it started, we'll be able to change it to any of those three things. If you want, I strongly recommend that you pause and try it yourself, and then unpause and check your answers with us. I'm going to show at least one way of how to solve it, sometimes two, but notice that's not the only way to convert. As long as you get the correct answer and you show your thinking process, don't just have the answer, write something down that shows how you came to get that answer. You're fine. Okay, so as long as you write down something of how you got your answer and you got the correct one, then you're good. Even if your work looks a little bit different than how I show it. Okay. And then also, whenever it's a fraction, please remember to always get it into fully simplified form or fully reduce it. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Remember, pause the video at any time and then unpause it to check if you want to try things on your own. For the first one, it says write 0.06 as a percent. There's several ways I can do this. So I know that this 6 is in the hundredths place because there's two numbers after the decimal, so 10th, hundredth. So I'm going to put 6 over 100. And if you're not good at knowing 10th, hundredth, thousandths, there's two numbers after the decimal, so there's two zeros, okay? And then once you have from a decimal to a fraction, if you want it as a percent is always out of 100. So you try to think, okay, how do I make this denominator become 100? Well, luckily for us, this one already is. So any number over 100 is whatever the top is, that's your percent, okay? So I could have done it that way. I also could have remembered this really cool thing of dip. This works whenever you're trying to change a decimal to a percent or a percent to a decimal. So the D stands for decimal, the P stands for percent. The I is so that it makes a word. And it also is to remind you that you always move the decimal two places. If you're starting as a decimal and want to become a percent, you would move 1, 2 to the right because essentially you're multiplying by 100, so you move the decimal twice. If you are moving from a percent to a decimal, put your pen here, you're starting as a percent, I would move it 1, 2 to the left because essentially you're dividing by 100, so you're moving the decimal two places left. That's what's really happening, but as a quick little reminder, decimal to percent, put your pen here, you're moving 1, 2 to the right. If it started as a percent and you want it to become a decimal, you'd move it 1, 2 to the left. Okay, so this one is 0.06. It is starting as a decimal. I want it to become a percent, so I'd move it two places right. 1, 2 to the right. Look at that, it's now after the 6, so it's 6%. Okay, if you remember that cool little trick of dip, you can get it that way, or you can do it from decimal to fraction and then get a denominator of 100 and get the percent. As long as you get 6% and show your thinking process, we're good. Okay, this is in the hundredths place, so 65 hundredths. Any number over 100, that top is your percent, so it's 65%. That was one way. Or I could have done dip. It started as 0.65. It's starting as a decimal. I want it to become a percent, so move it 2 to the right. 1, 2 to the right. It's right after the 5, so it's 65%. Okay, whichever way you prefer. Okay, this is in the tenths place, so 6 tenths. And remember, we said any number over 100 is a percent. So how do I get this denominator to become 100? Multiply by 10. So 6 times 10 is 60. So 60 over 100 is 60%. You could have done it that way. Okay, fraction, then get the fraction to have a denominator of 100, and you can write the percent. Or dip. Started as 0.6. I want it to become a percent, so 1, 2 to the right. 1, 2 to the right. It needs a zero placement holder, so 60%. Remember, you can always pause the video and try these yourself if you want. Okay, 1 and then 0.6, so that's 6/10. 1 and 6/10. I want to be able to have a denominator of 100, and I want this to be like one single fraction. So let's change this mixed number to an improper. So keep the denominator the same. 10 times 1 is 10, plus 6 is 16. Okay, so now I have 16 over 10 is the same thing as 1 and 6/10. How do I get that to become a denominator of 100? Well, 10 times what is 100? 10. So 16 times 10 is 160. So that means that this is 160%. And if you're like, whoa, wait, what? That doesn't make any sense. 1 is 100%. Anything less than 1 is under 100%. And anything greater than 1 is over 100%. So 0.6 is like 60%. 1 is 100%. So 100 plus 60 is 160. And if that was confusing, again, this is why I like DIP. I started as 1.6. So that's a decimal. I want to move it 1, 2 to the right to become a percent. So 1, 2 to the right, put a 0 placement holder, you get 160%. All right, now those were the only ones that we were doing with decimal to percent. So we can't use DIP anymore. We have to use other strategies. So 0.15 as a fraction. Well, this is in the hundredths place, the last number right here, the 5. So 15 over 100 because it's 15 hundredths. Or there's 2 numbers after the decimal, so put 2 zeros. This one only had 1 number after the decimal, so there's 1 0. This had 2 numbers after the decimal, so 2 zeros, if you're not good at your placement values. Okay, now that I established what it is as a fraction, remember you always want to reduce. Since it ends in 5 or 0, you know that 5 can go into both. 15 divided by 5 is 3. 100 divided by 5 is 20. Nothing else can go into both 3 and 20, so I'm done. 4/5 as a decimal. Okay. The easiest thing to do is always top divided by bottom. Okay. And if you're allowed to use a calculator, you could just go top divided by bottom, type it in, and then write what your answer is. If you're doing it by hand, you're not allowed a calculator. Top divided by bottom. Top dog goes inside the house, bottom goes outside. In and out. Inside the house, outside the house. 5 can't go into 4, so I'm adding a decimal and a 0. 5 goes into 40 8 times. So 4/5 is the same as 0.8. If I did it by hand or if I just typed it into my calculator, 4 divided by 5, I could get 0.8. Okay, regardless, I took the top, I divided by the bottom, and I got 0.8. If I wanted to do it as a decimal, sometimes this way works. Here's my initial fraction. And if you can get the denominator to become either 10, 100, or 1,000, then you can do it as a decimal. Well, I can make the denominator of 5 become 10. 5 times 2 is 10, so do the same thing on top. 4 times 2 is 8. And we know that now that you have a denominator of a power of 10, 10, 100, or 1,000, 8/10 is the same thing as 0.8. Okay, so either way you want to do it. If it's a calculator section, for sure, just do top divided by bottom and just write down what you typed into the calculator. Okay, 3/20 is a decimal. So again, if I was allowed a calculator, I'd just go 3 divided by 20 and get what I got. If you're not allowed a calculator, top divided by bottom. 20 can't go into 3, so I'm going to add a decimal and a 0. 20 goes into 30 once. When you subtract that, you get 10. Bring down your other 0. 20 goes into 100 5 times. 5 times 20 is 100. You have a remainder of 0, so it's 0.15. Or if you just typed it into the calculator, you still got 0.15. So that's if you did the top divided by the bottom. Or remember how we said if you could get a denominator of 10 or 100? So you have 3/20 to start with. I can make 20 become 100 because 20 times 5 is 100. So do the same thing on top. 3 times 5 is 15. 15 hundredths is 0.15. Okay. The next one, we want 7/8 as a percent. So there's two ways I could do this. I could go from a fraction to a decimal to a percent. Let's try that. So top divided by bottom, and let's just assume we're allowed to use a calculator. So 7 divided by 8, I type that in, I get 0.875. Then you want to change a decimal to a percent. So you move it 1, 2 to the right. 1, 2 to the right is 87.5%. This is the most useful thing because if you get a test score back, let's say you got 19 out of 25 or 9 out of 10, and you want to know what percent that is, you take the top of what you got, divide it by the bottom, the total number of problems, into your calculator, and you'll get a decimal. You move the decimal 1, 2 places, and that tells you the percent you got on your test. This is the most practical way to do it. Okay, but if you don't like, I can never remember which way to move the decimal. What was that word again? I can never remember dip. You could set your fraction equal to something over 100. Okay. And then whatever's over 100, that's what your percent is, right? And then you don't have to worry about moving the decimal. Whatever you get here in your proportion will end up being whatever the percent is. Okay. So you could think 8 times something is 100. I can't think of anything off the top of my head. So I'll solve by cross products. 8 times x is 8x equals 7 times 100. And 7 times 100 is 700. You want to simplify and get x by itself. So I divide by whatever is in front of the x because anything divided by itself is 1. So now you have 1x. Whatever you do to one side, you do to the other. 700 divided by 8 is 87.5. And then I was solving for the percent, so I just put a percent sign. Some people like doing it using the proportion because then they know that whatever they get here, that's their percent, and they don't have to worry about moving the decimal or anything. Others like it this way. Whichever floats your boat and you think is cooler, you do it that way. Okay, for the next one, it says write 7% as a decimal. Well, if it were me, I'd use dip. And this time I'm going from a percent to a decimal. And you're like, okay, so I have to move the decimal, but where is the decimal? I don't see the decimal anywhere. When there's no decimal present, it's always behind the number. And you're like, how do I remember that? Well, think of this. If I were to write $7, I just put it like this. That means $7, right? I'm too lazy to put the 0.00, but it's implied that the decimal is behind the number. So if ever you have a number in you need to know where the decimal is and it's not there, then just remember, okay, if I were to write money, the decimal is behind it. Okay, so the decimal starts here. I want to go from a percent to a decimal, so I'm going to move 1, 2 to the left. 1, 2 to the left, 0 placement holder, is 0.07. So 7% is the same thing as 0.07. If you don't like that way, okay, well, we know that percent means out of 100. So 7% is 7 over 100. And now that I have the fraction, I can go from a fraction to a decimal. You can go top divided by bottom, and you would get 0.07 if you did top divided by bottom in your calculator. Or a lot of you know 7 hundredths is 0.07. The 7 is in the hundredths place. Okay, regardless of how you did it, as long as you got 0.07 and you just wrote something down to show your thinking process, we're fine. Okay, 6% as a fraction. Well, I know that percent always means out of 100. So 6 over 100. And then I want it as a fraction. Great, it already is a fraction. I just need to remember, can I reduce it? Yep, they're both even. So I know 2 can go into both. 6 divided by 2 is 3. 100 divided by 2 is 50. I can't reduce it anymore, so I'm done. Now remember, some of my work might look a little bit different than yours. As long as you got the correct answer and you wrote something down to show your thinking process of how you got the answer, you're fine. Okay? If you want, you can always print off a blank copy, try it again, or write it down on a separate piece of paper, and then try it again and check your answers. And you can rewind and pause the video. You now know how to go back and forth between a decimal, percent, and fraction, no matter how it started. Congratulations.